All right, now I'm back in the garage today with another welder I just picked up. Now this thing I've seen it advertised everywhere. This is the YESWELDER 160 amp MIG welder. This thing will do MIG, flux, as well as lift TIG. So today we're gonna get this thing out of the box, see what all it comes with. We'll run it things through its paces and we'll see if it's worth the value or not. All right, let's start by getting this thing out of the box and see what it comes with. All right, now here it is all unwrapped and out of the box. Now my first impressions are this machine looks pretty well put together. The first thing I noticed was the actual MIG torch itself has an 8-foot cord. Some of these come with a really short one, which makes them really difficult to work with. So now let's open the additional box and see what else is in here. All right, first up we have the adapter that lets you go from 220 down to 110, which is really helpful. Next up, another really nice feature. This is a 8-foot ground lead, so that's really helpful. So this right here, this is the gas hose that runs from your gas bottle to the back machine. So a lot of times I've found some of these are just a bar bend fitting, so these screw-in ones are just really well put together and you don't have to worry about leaking. And lastly, this is your stinger lead. This is pretty self-explanatory. You hold your stinger rod, your electrode, and then you can start welding with that. Lastly, you have your instructions. You have another wheel for changing the wire diameter thickness and some extra ends in the middle of it. The only thing this box does not include is a TIG lead torch for when you decide to upgrade later and try your skill at TIG welding. All right, moving on to the machine itself. So this is the actual LED display. Looks really nice in here. I like the color differentiation as well. The mode selector right here, so this measures stick. Then we have lift TIG and goes right back up to MIG. The next selection we have here is the gas selection. This is actually pretty nice that it gives you the option. So this has CO2, is 100% CO2. This is mixed gas, what most of us use. And lastly, this is gasless, so this will be for your flux core welding. It just lets the machine know to make that change for you. Next up, this is your function selector switch. You can either put it in 2T, which is what most of us use, and then the 4T selection makes you just press the button on and you click it to turn it back off again. I prefer 2T, so that's where I'm going to leave it. Next up is your welding wire. This is actually really good for the synergy selection, so it lets you know that the machine is running 030 wire, or you can move up to 035. I have 030 wire, so that's where we're going to start with. All right, moving on, the next thing we're going to look at is this button right here in the middle. This will differentiate if you want it in smart welding mode, which is basically synergetic, which the machine will differentiate how much wire speed you need compared to the voltage you selected. And then if you go over to manual, it'll let you do whatever you want. So over here, we can make this adjustment. And then over here, we can make our wire speed adjustment. Now when switching over to the smart mode, now if I have 137 amps already selected here, and I'm going to try to change my wire speed to 5. It'll think about it for a second. It'll say, no, that won't work at 137 amps. We're going to change it to 24.9, which will give you a pretty good weld. This is also a good way to just get started. And if you need to dial it in later, you're going to keep it in this setting. You're going to switch back to the manual mode, and then you'll make your adjustments here. Another good point to mention, this machine has already recognized that we are at 220 volts. So this will allow me to bring the machine all the way up to 160 amps. Now if I had that in my 110 outlet, this will probably only get me up to 120 amps. And on the lower side of the machine, this has my torch lead connectivity. So if you need a positive torch lead, you're going to run it into this. And these are also DINS connectors. And you will have to change this depending if you're running on the flux core or the actual MIG mode itself. We'll go over that in a minute. And moving around the machine here, you can just have a closer look at the MIG torch itself. And then on the back side, you have your threaded gas inlet as well as your on-off switch and then the cooling fan on the bottom. Now on your right side of the machine, you can open up this door here, and this allows you to access where you're going to put your MIG wire. And this is the feeder itself. You're going to run the feeder through here. You will clamp your wire down, and you can feed it through to the MIG torch. All right, so moving on to the good stuff, we're going to start welding. So as a weld sample, I have some stainless sheet metal here we're going to start with, regular mild steel, and then some 1/8 inch mild steel as well. Now we're going to do both welding processes in just flux core and moving on to MIG. So when we get to full MIG, we're going to use this wire here. This is your solid core MIG wire. And now to do the stainless steel, which is pretty cool, we'll be using this stainless flux core wire. I've never actually done this before, so I'm excited to try it. Now in the past, I've melted it with just my solid wire, and on top of stainless, it's just going to rust and look ugly. So I think this might be a really good option. So moving on, this is your standard flux core wire. We'll be doing a whole round of this as well before we move on to the full MIG welding. All right, to get started, we're just going to now load it in our flux core wire. We're going to feed it through the actual feeder tube right here on the bottom. And after it passes over the wheel and into the MIG cord itself, we can drop the follower wheel. Following that, we can put our wheel washer back on with the tensioner spring. Now we can feed this through with the MIG gun. All right, for flux core welding, so you can see this wire right here is going into the negative lead, so I have torch lead negative. And now we're going to come in with our ground wire, and this is going to go into the positive connection. These two connections will be reversed when we're doing full MIG mode. All right, so now that we're all set up, it's time to start welding. So this is the current settings that I have the machine at. So at this point, we can start welding and we'll see how this looks. All right, here's a closer look at that weld after that first pass. The machine had no trouble keeping up at all, so now we're going to clean that up and see what it looks like. All right, there it is, all cleaned up with the wire brush. Now that is pretty much the best you're going to get out of a flux core welder as far as the neatness goes. Now I will say I was really impressed the machine did not want to blow through that thin material, so that's a big definite plus. All right, moving on. Now I have my 1/8 inch material set up in front of me. These are the current settings that I have the machine set at. So now we can start running our bead. All right, there's a closer look at that pass. We'll let it cool, and then we'll clean that flux right off of there. And then there's your closer look of that weld all cleaned up. All right, now getting ready to weld the stainless. So what I've done was already loaded up the stainless flux core wire in there. Now normally you can just push this trigger, but what I did find out, which is pretty cool, if you hold this here, this will manually push the wire through your MIG gun. And out comes your wire. So now we're ready to just clip this off and we can start welding that stainless. All right, now I have my stainless set out in front of me. My settings are 18 and 22.4. So let's just try to weld this up and see how it does. All right, there's a closer look at that weld. The heat kind of penetrated a little further in there and it melted through, but as you watch this thing cool and the metal changes shape, that flux is just popping off of there, which is kind of strange. Never seen that before, but again, I've never welded stainless in a flux. So we'll clean this up and we'll see what it looks like. All right, and there it is, cleaned up with just a wire brush. All right, so now we're done with the flux core welding. We're now going to switch this over to full MIG. So the first thing we're going to have to do is put the solid core wire into the machine, which is simple enough. Next up, we're going to change the polarity, so our torch lead is now positive. Next up, we're going to change the gas selector to mixed CO2 and argon. And then the last thing we need to do is connect our mixed gas tank to the back of our machine. All right, now that we have the machine switched over, I have brought out the original thin sheet metal that we welded earlier. I'll just flip this over, so we're going to weld the opposite side with a full MIG mode. There is a closer look at that weld. Now as I moved along, I did stop. And on this little pass here, I just slowed my movement down a little bit, so just give it a bit of a different look. Overall, that did an extremely well job. I barely had to clean that thing up. All right, and for comparison reasons, there is the full MIG mode. Nice penetration on the other side. And there is the comparison to what it looks like with a flux core weld. All right, next up I brought up my 1/8 inch material again. This is the same piece we welded earlier, but just flipped over. I have my machine set to smart, or the synergetic mode, so it's gonna just do its thing and do its own weld. All right, there is that weld, not even cleaned up yet and still smoking hot, but I don't think it'll get any better than that. All right, again, as a comparison, there is the full MIG weld. And on this side, that is the Flux core MIG weld, or FCAW. Both have good penetration all the way through, and I'm sure are gonna be just a super strong weld. However, the full MIG mode one, you can tell there's just no need for extra cleanup work. All right, and lastly, just to be thorough with the machine, we're gonna run this through a stick weld process. Now the changes on the lead hookups is pretty simple. We're gonna go from MIG over to stick, and you can see that it already turns off the gas selector off. And down below, the red is now electrode negative, and the ground is in the positive position. The MIG torch is now just disconnected. All right, so there you have it. This machine did a really good job today. I was actually quite impressed with it. This is my first experience using a YESWELDER. Now, from what I can tell you, if you're gonna get into welding and it's a new hobby for you, for just 200 bucks, this machine will get you everything you need to get started. It'll help you learn. You can start out with your flux core welding, which is super cheap. You just gotta add a cleanup on your welds when you're done with it. Moving on, you get yourself a gas tank, you got a full MIG. From there, you can always dabble in some stick welding. And lastly, when we always move forward, you get yourself a TIG torch and you can practice with TIG welding. Machine did really well with the light material. 1/8 inch was no problem at all. Probably could have done a lot thicker. I was surprised at how well it did. So if you need to weld something thicker with that, this will do easier, much easier through more than 1/8 inch. So as always, thank you for watching. I will leave a link in the description where you can get one of these, and I'll catch you in the next video.